On a crisp autumn morning in a small suburban town, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, sipping on her usual cup of orange juice, still half asleep. It was the kind of morning where everything seemed ordinary, a routine she'd been following for years. She ran a brush through her shoulder-length brown hair and adjusted her worn-out sneakers before heading out the door. Sophie was 16 years old, and her life, until recently, had felt simple, even comfortable. She wasn't the kind of girl who stood out much in the crowd, but she had a close group of friends, a supportive family, and a passion for soccer that kept her grounded. Her school, Jefferson High, was a typical institution: brick walls, loud hallways, and an overwhelming mix of personalities. Some students were popular, others were invisible. Sophie had always been somewhere in the middle. She wasn't an outcast, but she wasn't the star either. She had friends, played on the school's soccer team, and enjoyed hanging out at local cafes after school. She was, in most ways, just like any other teenager navigating the awkward world of high school. But lately, something had been eating at her. For as long as she could remember, Sophie had always been conscious of her weight. She wasn't overweight by any means, but she didn't have the slender frame that many of her peers seemed to flaunt. Her body was more curvy, her hips a little wider, her arms a little fuller. It wasn't something she talked about much, but the thoughts lingered. Sophie had tried to ignore them, telling herself it didn't matter, but recently, the self-doubt had crept in more often, clouding her once confident demeanor. She found herself wondering if she would ever be good enough in a world that seemed obsessed with perfection. As Sophie walked through the crowded halls of Jefferson High, she tried to push those thoughts aside. Her friends, Mia and Layla, waved at her from a locker, smiling brightly, their laughter filling the air. Sophie felt a brief surge of relief, like nothing had changed. She smiled back, though it was slightly forced, knowing deep down that the carefree days of high school might soon be slipping away from her grasp. The whispers that had started a few weeks ago were harder to ignore now. They weren't aimed directly at her, but Sophie knew better. It was the looks, the comments in passing, the snickers behind hands. Even when no one directly confronted her, the unspoken words stung just as much. That morning, she noticed it again. Two girls from her English class, Emma and Sarah, were talking as they walked past her locker. Their voices were low, but Sophie caught the words, "She's just so," before they quickly looked away. Sophie's heart sank. She didn't know if they were talking about her or someone else, but the feeling was enough to send her stomach into knots. Was it about her weight? About her clothes? Was her body really something people talked about when she wasn't around? The uncertainty weighed heavily on her, as the rest of the school day seemed to drag on in slow motion. At lunch, Sophie tried to stay in the safety of her group, where no one mentioned the awkward moments from earlier. Mia and Layla kept the conversation light, talking about the latest TV shows and school gossip, but Sophie couldn't fully focus. She kept glancing over at the group of popular girls who sat across the cafeteria. They were loud and confident, laughing at some inside joke, their thin figures and perfect hair making Sophie feel like she didn't belong. She quickly turned her attention back to her friends, forcing herself to smile. But inside, her mind was swirling with insecurities. She began wondering if Mia and Layla were beginning to notice the small changes in her behavior, the way she had been avoiding certain activities, the way she had stopped talking about her dreams. What would they think if they knew what she was thinking? As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Sophie packed her books into her bag and headed out to the parking lot. She was supposed to meet Mia and Layla for a quick soccer practice, but she wasn't sure she could face them. Her legs felt heavy, and the thought of running around with her teammates, who all seemed to have the perfect bodies, filled her with dread. Instead, Sophie decided to go home, where she could escape the whispers and the stares. As she sat in the passenger seat of her mom's car, looking out at the houses speeding by, she felt a familiar pit form in her stomach. She wanted to feel good about herself, but the pressure from school, from society, was getting harder to ignore. That night, Sophie stood in front of her mirror, scrutinizing her reflection. She pulled at the sides of her shirt, trying to flatten out the curve of her stomach. She wasn't sure why, but she felt this growing need to change. To be different. To fit in. But the more she tried to adjust, the more she felt a sense of sadness wash over her. Was this how her life would always be, fighting against her own body, wishing to be something she wasn't? The question lingered in her mind as she turned off the light and crawled into bed. The next day at school, Sophie tried to ignore the constant whispers and stares. She tried to act like everything was normal, like nothing had changed. But deep down, Sophie knew something was off. She didn't know it yet, but her life was about to be turned upside down in ways she couldn't yet imagine. This wasn't just about her body or the whispers in the hallway anymore. It was about to become something much bigger. Something that would change Sophie's life forever, and maybe even the way the entire school viewed body image and self-worth. But for now, Sophie was stuck in the quiet, painful world of uncertainty, wondering how much longer she could pretend everything was okay. The morning began like any other, with Sophie trudging through the school's front doors, her backpack slung over her shoulder and a tinge of dread settling in her chest. She had no reason to expect anything different from the day before, but that subtle, persistent anxiety continued to gnaw at her. The hallway felt just as it always did, filled with the chaotic rush of students, clattering lockers, and muffled chatter, but this time, Sophie's skin felt tighter, like she was walking through a fog of eyes that lingered a little too long on her. It was third period when the event happened, so sudden and jarring that it felt like time had stopped for just a few moments. Sophie was walking toward her history class when a group of girls, who she barely knew, but had seen around school, came into view. They were laughing, as teenagers often do, but there was something different about it. Sophie noticed the way they whispered to each other as they walked past, their glances sharp and deliberate. She kept her head down, trying to ignore the knot tightening in her stomach. But just as she passed them, one of the girls, Claire, who had always seemed kind enough in passing, made a comment loud enough for Sophie to hear. "Ugh, seriously, how does she even fit into those jeans? I swear, she's not even trying to lose weight." The words hit Sophie like a slap across the face. She froze for a moment, her hand gripping the strap of her backpack so tightly that her fingers started to ache. The laughter continued as they walked away, the sound echoing in her ears. Sophie felt her chest tighten. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. Her eyes started to sting, and she turned quickly, ducking into a nearby bathroom before anyone could see her breaking down. Inside the small, dimly lit bathroom, Sophie locked herself in a stall, her back pressed against the cool metal. She tried to steady her breathing, her heart racing with every breath. What had just happened? It wasn't the first time she'd overheard comments about her weight, but this time it felt different. The cruelty wasn't just behind her back, it was spoken directly to her, a harsh reminder of her insecurities. The room felt too small, too suffocating. She pulled her knees up to her chest, feeling the sharp sting of humiliation pulse through her. How had it all come to this? Just yesterday, she had been one of the many faces in the crowd, just another student trying to get through the day. Now, she felt like the target of everyone's scrutiny. It wasn't just the words that hurt, it was the way the whole scene played out. The laughter, the whispers, the way the other students seemed to turn a blind eye, as if this kind of cruelty was normal. Sophie stayed in the bathroom longer than she should have, staring at the tiled walls as if they might somehow provide an answer. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Mia, asking if she was okay. Sophie stared at the message for a long moment. Could she tell Mia? Could she explain what had just happened without sounding pathetic? Sophie didn't want to burden her friends with this. They had their own lives, their own worries. Besides, what could they do? She forced herself to calm down, taking a few shaky breaths, before wiping away the tears that had somehow appeared. Sophie stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for some semblance of the girl she had been just a few days ago. Who was she now? She didn't even recognize the person staring back at her. Her eyes were swollen, her face flushed with embarrassment, and she couldn't help but notice how her body seemed to be the one thing everyone noticed. The way it felt heavy, out of place, and too much. Sophie made a decision in that moment. She would go back to class. She would keep pretending, like she always did. She didn't want anyone to see how much the words had affected her, how deeply they had cut. But as she stepped back into the crowded hallway, a familiar feeling settled into the pit of her stomach. It was the feeling of being watched, of being measured by eyes that didn't know her, didn't care about her, but only saw the way she looked. The echo of Claire's words bounced off the lockers, replaying in her mind like a cruel loop. Sophie's hands trembled as she adjusted the strap of her backpack, desperately trying to appear unaffected. The rest of the day was a blur. Sophie barely spoke in her classes. She could hear the muffled voices of students around her, but it was as if she was trapped in her own head, each thought louder than the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched at every turn. Every glance from a classmate felt like a judgment, every quiet laugh a reminder of her worth, or lack of it. When the final bell rang, Sophie didn't wait for Mia or Layla. She quickly packed her things and hurried out of the school, desperate to escape. The walk home felt long and lonely, even though the streets were filled with people. Sophie kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. She just wanted to be invisible, to escape the whispers, the stares, and the judgment. It wasn't until she was halfway home that Sophie realized something had shifted inside her. The pain she felt from the bullying wasn't just about the incident anymore, it was about how deeply it had confirmed everything she feared. How her weight, her body, was the thing everyone saw first. How it was the one thing people used to define her. That night, Sophie lay in bed staring at the ceiling, too exhausted to cry anymore. She wondered if things would ever go back to the way they were before. Would people ever look at her and see her for who she truly was, or would she always be defined by her appearance? She couldn't escape the thought of what had happened, but more than that, she couldn't escape the feeling that it was only just the beginning. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one blending into the next as Sophie tried to navigate the halls of Jefferson High without letting the weight of what had happened pull her further into isolation. The sting of Claire's words hadn't faded, and each passing moment felt like a quiet reminder that Sophie was no longer just a girl trying to fit in, she had become a subject of scrutiny. It wasn't just the incident anymore, it was everything that followed. She could sense it in the way people looked at her, the way some students deliberately avoided eye contact, as if pretending they hadn't seen the cruel display the day before would somehow make it disappear. Even her friends seemed to notice her distance. Mia and Layla kept asking if she was okay, but Sophie always shrugged it off, telling them she was fine. But the truth was, Sophie wasn't fine, not by a long shot. Her morning routines had changed. She used to wake up early, excited about the day ahead, but now it was a battle just to get out of bed. Sophie found herself staring at her wardrobe for what felt like an eternity every morning, debating over what to wear. She picked out clothes that might hide the parts of her body she hated, clothes that would make her blend in and disappear, just another face in the crowd. It was as though she couldn't escape the constant measuring of her own worth against the expectations of everyone around her. Even simple decisions, like picking an outfit, became daunting. She didn't want to feel this way, but the voices in her head, amplified by the events of the past few days, wouldn't let her forget what had happened. At school, Sophie felt trapped in a never-ending loop of anxiety. Her teachers noticed the change in her behavior, the way she had become quieter, less engaged in class. Sophie had always been a solid student, contributing to discussions, participating in group projects, but now she barely spoke. Her friends started to worry more openly. Mia, who had been by her side since freshman year, asked her if something was wrong more times than Sophie could count. Layla, usually the more reserved of the group, had become more persistent in trying to get Sophie to talk. Sophie couldn't bring herself to open up to them, not because she didn't trust them, but because she didn't want to burden them with her pain. They were dealing with their own teenage drama, school crushes, tests, weekend plans, and Sophie felt like her issues were too much, too heavy. Instead, she withdrew even more, choosing silence over vulnerability. It felt easier to keep her feelings locked away, pretending like everything was fine, even though it wasn't. Her soccer practice was the worst part of the day. What used to be a source of joy and a place where Sophie felt confident had now become a space of overwhelming discomfort. The team hadn't changed, they still practiced the same drills, ran the same laps, but Sophie couldn't focus. Every time she stepped onto the field, all she could think about was how her teammates might be judging her. They were all so fit, so athletic, and here she was, the girl who didn't quite belong. The thought of running alongside them, of exposing herself in a way that might invite even more ridicule, was terrifying. Sophie began to skip practices more often, telling herself she was too tired or had too much homework. The truth was, she couldn't bear the idea of being seen. She couldn't escape the constant feeling of being judged. Even the team's coach, Mrs. Jensen, had noticed the shift in her energy, but Sophie dodged her questions with vague responses, telling her she was just feeling off lately. As the days stretched into weeks, Sophie's mental health began to deteriorate. She was anxious all the time, dreading the moment she'd step into school and feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance she had to maintain, to keep herself from being seen, to keep herself from feeling exposed. She started to feel numb, like she was going through the motions, but wasn't truly present. Her friends' attempts to cheer her up fell flat, and she began to withdraw even further. At home, Sophie found herself hiding away in her room more often than not, scrolling mindlessly through social media, comparing herself to others. She saw girls who looked so effortlessly perfect, their lives filled with smiles and adventure, and she couldn't help but feel like she was failing. Was she the only one struggling? Did anyone else feel like this? One afternoon, after yet another quiet lunch with Mia and Layla, Sophie sat on the edge of the bus stop bench, staring at the pavement beneath her feet, lost in thought. It had been weeks since the incident with Claire, and Sophie still couldn't shake the feeling that had defined her now. She had become obsessed with the idea that everyone at school was talking about her, whispering about her weight, her appearance. Even if they weren't, Sophie felt it, the weight of being constantly judged. She thought about the girls in her history class who had whispered about her, the ones who laughed behind her back, and how that had spiraled into something that consumed her every thought. No matter where she went, no matter what she did, it was always there, lurking in the background, feeding her insecurities. That was when the idea hit her, what if she could just disappear? What if, somehow, she could erase everything about herself that made her feel vulnerable? Sophie thought about dieting, about trying to lose weight to meet some ideal, some standard that wasn't even her own. She thought about working out relentlessly, changing her body to fit the mold of what was acceptable. But deep down, Sophie knew it wasn't about the weight. It was never really about the weight. It was about how she felt. It was about the constant nagging voice that told her she wasn't good enough, that her body wasn't enough. The next day, Sophie stayed home from school. She told her mom she wasn't feeling well, but it wasn't the flu or a cold that kept her in bed, it was the overwhelming feeling of exhaustion, of being drained from pretending to be someone she wasn't. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of her room. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Mia, asking if she was coming to practice. Sophie typed out a response, but deleted it before hitting send. What could she say? That she was too afraid to face the team? That she couldn't look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgusted? Sophie knew things couldn't continue like this. She felt stuck, trapped in her own thoughts, trapped by the things others had said and the way they made her feel. But she also knew she couldn't keep running away from the truth. She couldn't ignore the fact that what had happened, what she had experienced, wasn't something she could just brush off. It was affecting her, deep down, in ways she hadn't yet fully understood. As she lay there in her room, the weight of it all felt suffocating. But for the first time in weeks, Sophie allowed herself to think beyond the hurt, beyond the shame. She thought about the people who truly cared for her, Mia, Layla, her family, and realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. But first, she had to face it. She had to face herself. They were all so fit, so athletic, and here she was, the girl who didn't quite belong. The thought of running alongside them, of exposing herself in a way that might invite even more ridicule, was terrifying. Sophie began to skip practices more often, telling herself she was too tired or had too much homework. The truth was, she couldn't bear the idea of being seen. She couldn't escape the constant feeling of being judged. Even the team's coach, Mrs. Jensen, had noticed the shift in her energy, but Sophie dodged her questions with vague responses, telling her she was just feeling off lately. As the days stretched into weeks, Sophie's mental health began to deteriorate. She was anxious all the time, dreading the moment she'd step into school and feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance she had to maintain, to keep herself from being seen, to keep herself from feeling exposed. She started to feel numb, like she was going through the motions, but wasn't truly present. Her friends' attempts to cheer her up fell flat, and she began to withdraw even further. At home, Sophie found herself hiding away in her room more often than not, scrolling mindlessly through social media, comparing herself to others. She saw girls who looked so effortlessly perfect, their lives filled with smiles and adventure, and she couldn't help but feel like she was failing. Was she the only one struggling? Did anyone else feel like this? One afternoon, after yet another quiet lunch with Mia and Layla, Sophie sat on the edge of the bus stop bench, staring at the pavement beneath her feet, lost in thought. It had been weeks since the incident with Claire, and Sophie still couldn't shake the feeling that had defined her now. She had become obsessed with the idea that everyone at school was talking about her, whispering about her weight, her appearance. Even if they weren't, Sophie felt it, the weight of being constantly judged. She thought about the girls in her history class who had whispered about her, the ones who laughed behind her back, and how that had spiraled into something that consumed her every thought. No matter where she went, no matter what she did, it was always there, lurking in the background, feeding her insecurities. That was when the idea hit her, what if she could just disappear? What if, somehow, she could erase everything about herself that made her feel vulnerable? Sophie thought about dieting, about trying to lose weight to meet some ideal, some standard that wasn't even her own. She thought about working out relentlessly, changing her body to fit the mold of what was acceptable. But deep down, Sophie knew it wasn't about the weight. It was never really about the weight. It was about how she felt. It was about the constant nagging voice that told her she wasn't good enough, that her body wasn't enough. The next day, Sophie stayed home from school. She told her mom she wasn't feeling well, but it wasn't the flu or a cold that kept her in bed, it was the overwhelming feeling of exhaustion, of being drained from pretending to be someone she wasn't. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of her room. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Mia, asking if she was coming to practice. Sophie typed out a response, but deleted it before hitting send. What could she say? That she was too afraid to face the team? That she couldn't look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgusted? Sophie knew things couldn't continue like this. She felt stuck, trapped in her own thoughts, trapped by the things others had said and the way they made her feel. But she also knew she couldn't keep running away from the truth. She couldn't ignore the fact that what had happened, what she had experienced, wasn't something she could just brush off. It was affecting her, deep down, in ways she hadn't yet fully understood. As she lay there in her room, the weight of it all felt suffocating. But for the first time in weeks, Sophie allowed herself to think beyond the hurt, beyond the shame. She thought about the people who truly cared for her, Mia, Layla, her family, and realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. But first, she had to face it. She had to face herself. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And that, Sophie realized, was enough. One afternoon, as she sat in the art room, lost in the colors and shapes she was creating on the canvas, Sophie had a moment of clarity. She wasn't defined by what others thought of her. She wasn't defined by her weight, or by the mean words of a few classmates. She was Sophie, a girl who loved to create, who had friends who cared for her, and who had the strength to push through the toughest times. That was enough. Sophie smiled to herself, proud of the woman she was becoming, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wouldn't be easy. There would still be moments when she felt insecure, when the cruel whispers of her past would try to drag her back into darkness. But Sophie had learned that it wasn't the judgment of others that defined her, it was how she chose to see herself. And for the first time, Sophie chose to see herself as enough. She was enough. And that was all that mattered. As Sophie's journey continued, the world around her seemed to shift in small but significant ways. It wasn't an overnight transformation, and it wasn't perfect. The internal battle she faced every day, of self-doubt, insecurity, and fear of judgment, didn't magically disappear. They were still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but Sophie had begun to understand that they didn't have to control her. She didn't have to let them define who she was or who she was becoming. There was no magic moment where everything became clear and easy, but there were moments, small moments, that reminded her she was on the right path. Mia and Layla continued to be Sophie's anchor, offering unconditional support through every step of her struggle. They were patient with her when she pulled away, understanding when she needed space, but also persistent in showing up for her, day after day. Sophie appreciated their friendship more than ever. They didn't judge her, didn't pressure her to be someone else. They simply accepted her, flaws and all, and that acceptance became the foundation on which Sophie began to rebuild her sense of self. The days after she'd signed up for the art class were some of the most transformative. The small room filled with canvases, brushes, and the smell of paint became her sanctuary. For the first time in a long time, Sophie didn't feel the weight of the world's expectations pressing down on her. She could lose herself in the process, creating something that was entirely hers. Her paintings weren't about perfection, they weren't about what other people would think. They were about expression, about being raw and unfiltered. Sophie painted her feelings, the confusion, the anger, the sadness, but also the hope, the growth, and the strength she was finding within herself. One afternoon, as she stood in front of her latest painting, Sophie realized how far she had come. The bright, bold strokes of color she had laid down on the canvas mirrored the journey she had been on. It wasn't a neat, clean path. It wasn't perfect. There were messy, jagged edges, and it wasn't always easy to make sense of. But there was beauty in the chaos. Sophie stepped back and studied the work she had created, seeing more than just the surface. She saw how far she had come, not just in her art, but in her personal growth. The painting wasn't just a reflection of where she had been, it was a symbol of where she was going. At school, Sophie's interactions began to feel less suffocating. She didn't dread the lunchroom as much, didn't feel her heart race when she passed by groups of students whispering or laughing. There were still days when she felt like an outsider, still days when her insecurities crept back in, but those moments were no longer all-consuming. Sophie had begun to rebuild her confidence, brick by brick. She wasn't the same girl who had walked into school in a haze of fear and self-loathing. She was stronger now, more sure of herself, and more aware of the power she had to shape her own story. Sophie's classmates began to notice the change, too. It wasn't an obvious transformation. She didn't suddenly become the most popular girl in school, or the loudest voice in the room. But there was something about the way she carried herself now, something that made others take notice. It wasn't just that Sophie had stopped hiding, it was that she had started to embrace who she was, imperfections and all. And that was something people respected. Her friends began to open up to her in ways they hadn't before, sharing their own struggles and fears. It was as though they, too, had begun to feel that it was okay to be vulnerable, to admit that they weren't perfect. Sophie's bravery, even in the face of all the judgment and hurt she had faced, had created an environment where others felt safe enough to be real, too. One day, a surprise visit from Claire, a distant memory of the girl who had once made Sophie's life a living nightmare, forced Sophie to confront the past in a way she hadn't expected. Claire, now no longer the confident, untouchable girl she once was, came up to Sophie during lunch. Her eyes were downcast, and her voice shaky when she spoke. "Sophie, I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said. Sophie blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realized I was awful to you. You didn't deserve that." Sophie's first instinct was to brush it off, to let the words wash over her without reacting. But something inside her stopped her. This wasn't about Claire's apology, it was about Sophie's own healing. For the first time, Sophie realized that Claire's actions no longer had the power to hurt her. She didn't need her apology to move forward. Instead, Sophie met Claire's gaze with a calmness she hadn't known she was capable of. "Thank you for saying that," Sophie said softly, "but it's okay. I'm okay now." It wasn't that she had forgiven Claire, not exactly. It was more that she had stopped allowing the pain from that moment to control her. She had taken back her own power. By the time the school year came to an end, Sophie was no longer the same girl who had walked through those halls months ago. She had learned how to be her own advocate, how to find strength even when she didn't feel strong, and how to stop letting the opinions of others shape her identity. Sophie had started to understand that the power to be happy, to be confident, was always within her. She had just needed to unearth it. And, in the process, Sophie had learned something invaluable: the journey to self-love wasn't linear. There would be setbacks, there would be moments of doubt, but those were part of the story, too. They didn't define her. She did. On the last day of school, Sophie stood on the steps of Jefferson High, feeling the warm breeze against her skin. Her friends were gathered around her, laughing and reminiscing about the year, and Sophie couldn't help but smile. She had made it through one of the hardest periods of her life, and she was stronger for it. As she looked ahead to the future, she felt a deep sense of pride, not just for what she had accomplished, but for who she had become. And as Sophie walked away from the school, she carried with her a sense of hope, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready. The journey was far from over, but Sophie was no longer afraid. She was ready to keep moving forward, one step at a time. And this time, she would be walking for herself. The summer that followed was nothing like Sophie had imagined. It wasn't a carefree, perfect escape from the pressures of school. It wasn't about taking long vacations or attending parties every weekend. No, Sophie spent the summer confronting parts of herself she had long avoided. It wasn't easy. The quiet moments often brought up old insecurities, and the absence of school gave her too much time to think. But it was also the time she had needed all along. The time to heal. Sophie used the time to dive deep into her passion for art. She spent long hours sketching, painting, and experimenting with new techniques. She poured her feelings onto the canvas, feeling each brushstroke as a release, as though she was slowly freeing herself from the chains that had bound her for so long. Her art became more than just a hobby, it became her therapy, her voice, and in some ways, it was the only place she truly felt understood. But there were also moments when Sophie allowed herself to just be. To relax and step outside the cycle of self-reflection that had consumed her for months. She spent afternoons with Mia and Layla at the local park, laughing and chatting about everything and nothing at all. It felt good to not have to worry about how she looked or whether someone was talking behind her back. Those carefree moments, those simple exchanges with her friends, reminded her that the world wasn't all judgment and expectations. There was kindness, laughter, and connection, and those were the things that mattered most. Sophie had begun to let go of the parts of herself she had spent so much time hating. She was no longer chasing some elusive ideal of perfection. Instead, she was learning to accept herself, flaws and all. One evening, after a long day spent painting in the garage, Sophie sat outside, staring up at the stars. The warm air was thick with the scent of summer, and for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt at peace. She thought about everything she had been through, the bullying, the pain, the loneliness, and how far she had come. She was no longer the girl who had hidden away in shame. She was stronger, wiser, and, above all, more compassionate with herself. It wasn't about the opinions of others anymore. Sophie realized that the most important thing was how she saw herself. And, for the first time, she liked the person she had become. She felt proud of the strength she had uncovered and the courage it took to change her narrative. The quiet summer evenings gave way to the reality of the coming school year, and as the days grew shorter and the first day of senior year loomed on the horizon, Sophie knew that things would be different. She wasn't going to be the same girl who had walked through those halls before. She had changed, and those changes would echo through her actions, her relationships, and the way she carried herself. Her confidence wasn't perfect, and there would still be days of self-doubt, but Sophie had learned how to handle those moments. She had learned to recognize them for what they were, temporary, and not allow them to control her. When the first day of school finally arrived, Sophie was nervous, but it was a different kind of nervousness than before. It wasn't a fear of judgment or rejection, but more of a quiet anticipation. She had grown, and while she still had a lot to learn, she knew she was capable of facing whatever challenges came her way. As she walked through the school doors, the familiar buzz of students filled the air, and for the first time, Sophie didn't feel like she was on the outside looking in. She didn't feel invisible, as she had for so long. She was walking into this new year with a sense of purpose, a sense of self that she had never had before. In the weeks that followed, Sophie continued to build on the lessons she had learned over the summer. She was more open, more vulnerable, and more willing to stand up for herself when the need arose. When Claire tried to approach her again one day, Sophie was ready. Claire had changed too, Sophie could see that. She had grown, though in a different way. Claire no longer seemed to carry the same arrogance she once had, and Sophie couldn't help but feel a sense of empathy for her. The past couldn't be undone, but it didn't need to define their futures. Sophie had let go of the anger that once consumed her. She had moved on, and in doing so, she had created space for herself to grow even further. Sophie also began to see how far-reaching her personal transformation had been. Her friends, Mia and Layla, were still by her side, but they had noticed changes in themselves as well. They had begun to embrace their own flaws, their own unique qualities, and they had stopped trying to fit into molds that others had created for them. It was as though Sophie's journey had sparked something in them too. They didn't have to be perfect, and they didn't have to apologize for who they were. Together, the three of them shared moments of honesty, laughter, and acceptance. It was a support system that felt unbreakable. As the school year progressed, Sophie continued to pour herself into her art. She wasn't looking for validation from anyone else. Her art was for her growth, for her healing. And as she painted, as she created, Sophie knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger. She had found her voice, and she was ready to use it in whatever way felt right. She was no longer confined by the labels others had placed on her, nor was she defined by her past. Sophie had discovered that the most important relationship in her life was the one she had with herself, and it was one she was learning to nurture every day. Looking back on everything she had been through, on the bullying, the pain, the insecurities, Sophie realized something profound. None of it had been in vain. She had learned to confront her fears, to challenge the narratives that others tried to impose on her, and to love herself even when it seemed impossible. The scars from her past still remained, but they no longer held power over her. They were a part of her story, but they didn't define it. Sophie was more than the sum of her experiences. She was a story in progress, and that was something worth celebrating.